PPs.
Ladies and gentlemen, me never know say Juliet HOLNESS a bully. Me never know say Juliet HOLNESS a bully. Uno come and look a bit there. Make we examine or really go on the parliament. I think I write about here so real quick, cause what can go so? Juliet HOLNESS a bad girl.
Are paid to do. And in the interest of efficiency in the procurement process, it was felt that the sector committee, again, is just a duplication, and an entity whose time has come for it to be taken out of the procurement process. 22.5.
November 20.
Me say Juliet HOLNESS run up and shame FAYVAL Williams. You know, look good.
Right. All right. That he note that there are a number of goods and services that will be exempt.
Florence, Wagwan.
Be exempt in services for Grand Gala, for example. Yes, the creative industry. Yes. Yes. All of those services. The member from St. Andrews South asked about the definition of open national competition. Open national competition, member, means it will be open just to Jamaicans. It would have to be. Why? Why? And then, it's not where it's advertised. And similarly, side of Jamaica. And call off contracts, and yes, you are correct for particular goods or service, and would be done. But the list on at
It come like Juliet HOLNESS get upset cause Mark Golding attack so much, cause she don't like Mark Golding, you know. From Mark Golding call her out be the speaker of the house, you know, a sour relationship right there, so. From him call out the conflict of interest. Yeah.
I mean, these are the different methods of procurement, right? That's there on 22A. All right, I'll come back to that one.
Me not lie still, the dialogue between Mark Golding and FAYVAL here, so it seemed very respectful. And probably that's the reason why Juliet did have a problem, because you can hear a pin drop in the house. I first hear the House of Representatives so quiet with so much people in there.
Okay. All right, according to the levels of competition. So negotiation are asked about repeat. You would want that, right? What, open competition? Competition would include open national competition, the member procurement, debt, do activities with the national debt that was added, transactions. All right. You will note that there is option states.
It's constant interruption, and leader of the opposition.
All right, so the new proposed.
We have action.
Minister and leader of the opposition, this is very unusual. Very, very unusual. No, this is most inappropriate. This constant interruption and back and forth is not the way that we would normally. Members, Members, I do not need your assistance. Members.
She's uncomfortable with FAYVAL Williams having a respectful back and forth about, like, what the...
Minister, take a seat, please.
She's visibly upset. Look at her.
Thank you. Madam Speaker, I think Madam Speaker, I rise on a point of order. The Minister, Madam Speaker.
Acting House Leader.
Thank you for your guidance, my Clarendon colleague.
Big up, Sharon.
I think the member should be allowed to either conclude the debate, or if the leader of the opposition has additional questions, there's an appropriate approach by the standing orders that he can use to ask these questions. The off-mic interruptions of the presenter, though the points may be valid, it's not the appropriate mechanism. So with all due respect to the leader of the opposition, if we are governed by a standing order, my friend, we are governed by standing orders, not by your opinion. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker.
Madam Speaker, the leader of the opposition in his presentation did rightfully pose certain questions. Those questions were not sufficiently clarified, and hence the back and forth. It might be appropriate, Madam Speaker, as you have noted, that a pause because there has to be some changes that flow already from what the questions have elicited. There might have to be a pause to enable the draft people to do those amendments before we are able to terminate, before we are able to conclude this debate.
Leader of opposition business, with the utmost respect, that's a challenge I have. I have not identified even one amendment. I am not able to identify even one amendment to the discussion. So what happened? I am speaking. Opposition leader, I am speaking. I am on the floor.
Watch out! What coupon she to?
Hey, who mess is this?
Look how she blink for your guy them.
Who mess is this?
What a banger. Are them something I want? Look what she to.
Even one amendment. I am not able to identify even one amendment to the discussion. So what happened? I am speaking. Opposition leader, I am speaking. I am on the floor. So when the discussion goes in the way it is going, where you have had the opportunity to outline the concerns, recommendations, suggestions, and questions, and then the minister is answering, and you are not on the mic, it is not recorded in Hansard, the public is not hearing anything that you have to say, it becomes a disjointed interruption between the minister and yourself, and it actually does not carry well. So, the minister can't just have a conversation with you alone. She has a duty to the members of parliament in here and the rest of the country. So, right, so nobody is hearing you, opposition leader, at all. Nobody hears you if you're not on the mic.
She is upset. Lord have mercy. Man, she is upset, y'all. Damn. I hope it's not your cup.
Go.
Minister, you may not want to speak until the House is quiet.
She's not begging no break. I said, come on, she said, send her.
Anyway,
Okay, so
members, allow Minister to conclude her response.
Just going to explain the difference. You were talking about the national versus international, open international, open national. Those are levels of competition that speaks to, in clause 9, the methods of competition. Okay. All right, so we'll deal with it in committee stage. All right. And you had asked about what are the new amendments. The procurement of banknotes and coins for issue by the Bank of Jamaica, that is new. That was
Minister,
added to
if
the-
you continue to have a conversation with one individual who is not on the mic and is not making a presentation, then you also contribute to the disorder in the House. Minister, you're not speaking to one individual. You had a series of questions and discussion, and you are responding for the benefit of the entire Parliament and all of Jamaica.
Okay, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker.
You see how she hit the button hard? This lady got an anger problem. You know who run that house, right? You know who run that house, right? Yeah, she got an anger problem. She one of them. She one of them.
The new proposed amendments are the procurement of banknotes and coins for issue by the Bank of Jamaica, the implementation by the Bank of Jamaica of monetary policy and foreign exchange policy through financial contracts, financial advisory services procured from the International Finance Corporation in respect of road development projects in Jamaica, and technical cooperation and assistance for the provision of goods, works, and services pursuant to any agreement between the Government of Jamaica through the Jamaica Special Economic Zone Authority and the Government of the Republic of Singapore through the Singapore Cooperation Enterprise related to or connected with the implementation of the Jamaica Logistics Hub initiatives. Thank you. Those are, Madam Speaker, those are the new proposed exemptions. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Minister, would you kindly consider whether you're electing to close the debate or whether you are going to continue?
Yeah, this did not go well. And this lady's exposing herself more and more. Man, I can't wait for Mark Golden to win the election. I'm talking about the only issue I have with the PMP is not an issue. I need to hear from them in regards to the Samoa agreement. That's it. That's all. I need to know where they stand with the Samoa law. That is a very important issue for me personally. All right? Because that's going to determine whether or not I want to grow and have kids in Jamaica. Real talk. All right? Big facts. Big facts. But let me hear what Mark Golden had to say here.
Madam Speaker, I just want to, first of all, say I appreciate the decision made last week not to rush through this particular bill on the day it was the debate commenced, but to allow some time, a week in this instance, for members on both sides who may wish to prepare to do so. I think that is the best practice. That is what the standing orders contemplate as the norm, and I think it is always to be maintained unless there is some serious exigency that requires it to be departed from. Madam Speaker, the Public Procurement Act was enacted under the last People's National Party administration and represented a fundamental overhaul of the procurement system in the public sector in Jamaica. And it has been subject to some adjustments over time, which is not surprising given how complete a departure it was from what existed before. And of course, regulations have also been made pursuant to the Act in an attempt to put into implementation some of the potential innovations that the Act contemplated. The extent to which those innovations are in fact having an impact is unknown to us. I don't know if the Minister has data on that, but the idea of using procurement to encourage economic development through giving more vulnerable, less well-endowed economic actors an opportunity to do business with the government and to grow their business and expand through the significant procurement power that the state has was one of the positive aspects of this legislation, and it would be good to know to what extent it is actually having that effect. Minister, there are a few questions I have on the bill, which I would appreciate being answered, whether today or if you want to close it on another occasion, that would be, of course, your call. But I begin with the new Section 5, or the amendments to Section 5, which is a definition section. This is in Clause 2 of the bill. And it relates to the definition initially of open national competition. And it says that open national competition means a procurement opportunity advertised in Jamaica only. So the hook used by the definition that determines whether or not something is open national competition is where the advertising of the procurement opportunity takes place. Now, in the world we live in, where virtually everything is on the internet, the fact that something is exclusively advertised here does not necessarily mean that the persons who respond to that and who seek to take up that opportunity are in fact lawfully doing business in Jamaica. And so if the intent of this concept of open national competition is to have that part of the procurement process open to Jamaican actors or firms that have established a place of business here and are lawfully transacting business here, hooking that on where the opportunity is advertised is not an efficacious way of achieving that objective. So I just wanted you to respond to that, Minister, to explain what is the underlying policy directive behind that definition, and explain whether or not the way in which it has been couched achieves that policy objective. Similarly, or relatedly, the definition of open international competition makes no reference to the fact that the opportunity may have to be advertised internationally, for example. It doesn't relate to the definition of open national competition. It's not structured in the same kind of way. It simply says means a procurement opportunity for participation by any supplier. So it surprised me because I thought that if you're juxtaposing open international competition with open national competition, the definitions would relate to each other in a coherent way, whereas one of them speaks to being advertised locally and the other doesn't use a concept of advertising at all in it, but simply says it's an opportunity for participation by any supplier. And it really makes me wonder whether the open national competition definition is really adequate for the policy purpose that underlies that concept. I move to another definition, and this is the definition of restricted competition. And I'll read it in tandem with what is now going to be Section 22A, big A, of the new Part 3 of the Act. And that new Part 3 is introduced by Clause 9 of this bill, which is on page 4. And one notes that in subsection 1 of the new 22A section, it lists 6 different methods of conducting procurement: open bidding, restricted bidding, single source procurement, request for proposals without negotiation, request for proposals with consecutive negotiations, or request for quotations. So there's some specific methodologies that are listed in that. When you go back and look at the definition of restricted competition, it says restricted competition means a procurement opportunity that is limited to a single source procurement or to participation by 2 or more selected suppliers. Now, neither of those 2 concepts used in the definition of restricted competition are mentioned in that list of procurement methodologies in 22A subsection 1. Yes, sorry, participation, yes, exactly, you're correct. But it doesn't encapsulate any others of the list there. And because you have restricted bidding in B, but that is not included in the definition of restricted competition, it's a bit confusing as to how the concept of restricted competition relates to the list in 22A1. I would have thought that the definition of restricted competition would at least be clear as to which of those methodologies listed in 22A1 fall within that rubric. And one would have thought, for example, that restricted bidding would be one example of that, but it isn't mentioned in the in the definition at all. And I'm just pointing this out because this legislation has to be used by economic actors, and it's important that it be clear to users, you know, and it's a somewhat, I would say, technical piece of legislation. It is a procurement in the public sector is a bit of a specialized field. And so things that may be obvious to persons who practice their careers exclusively or mainly in that field are not necessarily clear to users who don't spend their life in that domain. So it's quite important that the legislation be coherent and that the definitions and the substantive provisions work well together so that it's easy to follow what is intended. I move on to clause 10 of the bill, and this is a new section 23 that is replacing the existing section 23. And subsection 1 has a general rule in it. It says, except as otherwise provided for in sections 24 and 25, a procuring entity shall conduct procurement by means of open competition. Now, open competition is not a defined term, as far as I know. Maybe I don't know if it's defined in the Principal Act, but it's not defined in the bill before us. And it seems to me that given that that's the general rule, there ought to be an explanation of what that means, especially since there's so many other terms of art being used in the legislation around different approaches to procurement. And I felt that that was something which ought to be considered. I move to clause 13 of the bill, and this is to do with framework agreements and so-called call-off contracts that are, as I understand it, procurement exercises that are done pursuant to a general agreement that governs all of those. So you have a framework agreement in place. It may be, let us say, for example, it could be in relation to clause 30 on page 8. So you might have a framework agreement governing, let us say, procurement of computer equipment for the government. And then you would have these call-off contracts, which would be from time to time, as a particular MD&A may need to buy something, that it will be done pursuant to the framework agreement, and presumably in a more simple fashion, because the governing framework is set out in the master agreement that we call a framework agreement. So these call-out contracts would be simple contracts that just incorporate, perhaps by reference, the detailed provisions that would be in the framework agreement. Subsection 3 of this it's actually 25F is a provision in the Act, but clause 13 is the one amending it. Subsection 3 says the procurement contract approval limit for call-off contracts in the framework agreement is the aggregate estimated value of anticipated call-off contracts projected to be awarded under the framework agreement. So when you are intending to engage in procurement under this framework agreement mechanism, you have to the procuring entity has to make a projection of the aggregate estimated value of anticipated call-off contracts to be awarded during the term of the agreement. And that can be over a period of years. I can't remember how many years it's permitted to run for. But what my question really was, what happens if prices move in that period? Should there not be some mechanism for inflation-related adjustments? Because if you're capped at an aggregate, which is set at the beginning of the life of the framework agreement, you could find that due to whatever international or local events that weren't contemplated, prices move, and then it kind of throws out your whole procurement arrangement, because you hit the limit, whether the volume of what you are buying hasn't been yet achieved, for example. So I thought it might have been useful to build in the idea that the aggregate should be inflation indexed, so that it's self-adjusting for the life of the framework agreement. It was a thought that occurred to me. If I was drafting it, I would put that in, put it that way, in a commercial agreement. The next question I have for you, Minister, relates to clause 21, which is repealing the first schedule to the Act and substituting a new first schedule. Now, as the member for South East St. Andrew has indicated, the list in the new first schedule is very extensive, and I have some questions on the specifics of that list. But before I get to that, my question for you is this. Is this list in the new first schedule that's part of this bill, is it identical in content to the existing first schedule that exists today? Or are there items which have been omitted, which used to be subject to this exemption, or new items that have been added that were not previously exempt from the provisions of Parts 3 and 5 of the Act. So this is important because the extent to which anything appears on this list means that the procurement rules applicable to it are much more limited and therefore, much more amenable, potentially, to things that we don't want to happen. So it's important, and it's such an extensive list, as the member who spoke before me said. I mean, for example, consultancy services, is that the word they use? That is a huge and very uncertain domain. You can consult on anything. So, I mean, it is, you can be a consultant on sea turtles. You can be a consultant.
People, read between the lines. Even if you don't understand fully all the fancy word he's using, basically, what I'm getting from this is it's not clear enough, and it leaves open things that we don't want to happen, like mass corruption. Yeah. That's what is being exposed here, ladies and gentlemen. Alright? These questions that Mr. Golden is asking is very, very important questions. Let's continue.
A consultant on artificial intelligence. You can be a consultant on football gear. You can be a consultant on virtually anything. So for that to be in a list of exemptions seems to me to create a big loophole in the procurement system. I had a more specific question. Item X on this list, which is on page 12, mentions national level financial transactions. And I was just wondering if you could confirm what a national level financial transaction is. Is a national level financial transaction intended to be a transaction to raise finance in the domestic market? Is that what it means? Or is a national level financial transaction a financial transaction that's being entered into by Jamaica as a nation state? That, I think, was the two possible different interpretations of what that means. It's not a term of art, and I think it needs to be clarified what is intended by it. Because if it means something, a transaction involving the domestic financial markets, the capital markets in Jamaica, that's one thing. Or if the definition could either be, or the term national financial transaction could either be focusing on the domain where the transaction is being executed, or it could focus on the party that is doing the transaction, who is executing the procurement, as being a national level actor, i.e. the government of Jamaica. It wasn't clear to me what this meant, and I thought it'd be useful for that to be explained. And the other point I want to make is that we have here that procurements during a period of public emergency are exempted, and given the regularity with which we have states of emergency being declared in Jamaica over the last several years, it seems to me that this really opens a potential for abuse in the procurement by the Ministry of National Security of services. The services, Portaloos, their food, Portaloos, etc. This is a big gap that that really there ought to be in the way in which you have been using states of emergency, there's absolutely no reason to exempt procurement from the procurement rules for that. None. Yeah, none whatsoever. None whatsoever, because these states of emergency come and go, and you hardly notice them nowadays, other than the fact that they are.
You hear that, ladies and gentlemen? They are exempt from the procurement rules? Wait a minute, let's go back to that.
It seems to me that this really opens a potential for abuse in the procurement by the Ministry of National Security of services. The services, Portaloos, their food, Portaloos, etc. This is a big gap that that really there ought to be there's in the way in which you have been using that. Or it could focus on the party that is doing the transaction, who is executing the procurement, as being a national level actor, i.e. the government of Jamaica. It wasn't clear to me what this meant, and I thought it'd be useful for that to be explained. And the other point I want to make is that we have here that procurements during a period of public emergency are exempted, and given the regularity with which we have states of emergency being declared in Jamaica over the last several years, you know, it seems to me that this really opens a potential for abuse in the procurement by the Ministry of National Security of services. The services, Portaloos, their food, Portaloos, etc. This is a big gap that you're
I am so happy that Mark Golden raised this point. Mark Golden is definitely the man for the job. Ladies and gentlemen, he is asking all the right questions. Excuse me, because I personally don't trust this government that is in power right now. I don't trust them as far as I can push them. Alright? Those little things, those every minute you see these states of emergency, no procurement, so they could just run money through states of emergency. Just run money through it. Run money through it. Little checks and balances, huh?
That really there ought to be no, there's in the way in which you have been using states of emergency, there's absolutely no reason to exempt procurement from the procurement rules for that. None. Yeah, none whatsoever. None whatsoever, because these states of emergency come and go, and you hardly notice them nowadays, other than the fact that they are announced. But in terms of their operational impact, you drive through the areas concerned, you don't see any difference whatsoever as to what is going on. So it seems to me that this is a peculiar exemption, given the way in which they are being used. But Madam Speaker, those are my questions and comments on this bill. I would be grateful for substantive responses, well-considered and well-informed responses to the questions raised. And I thank you for the opportunity to have made my presentation today. Thank you.
Big up Marky G. Apart from, you know, the little stint that what's her name? JULIET HOLNESS had with FAYVAL Williams embarrassing the lady. That was constructive questions. That's something you could watch over and over again and take pointers to. We need to watch this procurement thing, man. We got to keep an eye on it. You know what I'm saying? Really got to keep an eye on it. So let me know what y'all think about that. Storm up the comment section.